Let's see. Audio's good, video's good.
Audio, video are good, and we are both here wearing our hats. What is going on, Hot Take Nation? It is DRW here for another episode of the Hot Take of the Day podcast. And today I am joined with Mark Mills. And I have to say, when I was thinking about the introduction, there is so much that he has accomplished in his life that, first of all, I feel quite almost incapable to be able to measure up to everything he's done. But we do have something in common, which is that we both went to Queen's University. Now, I was doing it executive MBA style, but my father-in-law went there, my mother-in-law went there, and so I feel very connected with Queen's. We're going to talk about that. But Mark, first, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for coming on. I can't wait to talk to you today.
Thanks for having me on. And you're now the third person in these great United States of America that I have met south of the border that went to my alma mater. This is my Queen's ring right here.
Love it.
And the Queen's alum just don't like to leave Canada, I guess.
Now, are we gonna take credit for Elon? Because I know he was. I know, like, the little known fact about Elon was his journey through Queen's University.
Right. Well, he's South African, then Canadian, then American, so he gets one extra brownie point from Her Majesty's roots. But he's like Bill Gates. He never finished university, and I quit graduate school. And what I decided in the years since is that I made a mistake. I should have quit undergraduate like Elon and Bill Gates.
I know they did okay with that, which actually, ironically, it is where I did want to start. And I mean, I'm not joking. If you don't know Mark, I think physicist, fellow with the Manhattan Institute, Northwestern University faculty, founder of Cottonwood Venture Partners, which is the hat venture fund. I mean, he's done everything. So there's so much to talk about. We're both wearing our branding now. Today,
you told me you wore your hat because you had a bad hair day.
I did, and actually, if I'm totally honest with you, I'm not gonna lie. I was also having a bad eye day. And in particular, this is the crazy thing about Zoom, right? And I think for those, before I got banned from LinkedIn, which we'll also talk about, I had posted about a very good friend, a family friend of ours who had brain cancer, and unfortunately she passed away on Sunday. And so only in a COVID world can you not have a funeral for all your friends unless you're protesting their life. And so we had a Zoom funeral earlier today. So not only was my hair bad, but my eyes are quite red. And so I wanted to hide it in the shadows. And so hence the hat and the branding. It's perfect, right? Because this is the COVID world. You can go funeral, have an interview, make like founding investments in new businesses, and protest the world all without leaving your house.
You should have labeled the funeral a protest. You were protesting her early departure, which is always sad.
I did. I suggested the same thing, and it is crazy that. Anyway, that's an entirely different topic. But
yeah, we don't want to go to that rabbit hole. I mean, you can get me going on the crazy COVIDs, and I won't quit.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, I mean, and anyway, so we will talk about that later. I want to start with the university. And your sort of tongue-in-cheek comments about undergrad and dropping out and the success of a Bill Gates and an Elon Musk and the things they learned in university versus what the average person learns in university, and then not talking COVID, but the new educational experience for kids in this current COVID world. I'm curious how you think about it as an educator and as someone who's run the full gamut of founding partners and pedigrees and et cetera.
Well, it's kind of it. I've written about this recently. Started writing. I've been writing about telecommuting and remote education for a long time. I've been studying it for a long time. In fact, when I worked at Bell Labs Canada, Bell Northern Research,
Nortel.
Well, that was pre-Nortel. Didn't get called Nortel until it was Northern Telecom, back in the Jurassic era, before you were on the Earth. I was working, and the dinosaurs roamed the earth then too.
Yes.
The idea of telecommuting was very much on everybody's minds because communications were getting better so fast. I was on the team that put the first fiber optic cable in, so we knew then that bandwidth is exploding. It would enable all kinds of things, and in fact, a NASA engineer, as I wrote in my City Journal piece back in I don't know, March. So if you do the magic Google machine and my name with a P and do City Journal, you'll find my March piece where I pointed out the NASA engineer back in the, I think it was late 70s. He was working from home using, telecom faxes, dial-up kind of modems. There was no internet then, of course. And he coined the phrase telecommunications instead of commuting. And ever since the dawn of the telegraph, which is the first instrument of electronic communication, people have been predicting the end of travel and the end of all kinds of things because of communication. So we've had this great experiment with sending millions of kids home to remote learn. So I think my forecast is already coming true. So I said back in March and April that two things would happen. In the short term, we would do this because it was doable. It wasn't doable any other time in history. 20 years ago, you couldn't have sent 30% of the workforce home and let them continue working in any fashion.
Yeah.
You could maybe send them papers by courier, and talk on the phone, but there'd be no Zooming, no video communication, no internet that was sufficient to this task. So it's a big shift. We went from 5% of the workforce in January of 2020 were full-time telecommuters. So the Census Department's tracked this data for 30 years. So it's been creeping up from a fraction of a percent to 5%. By March, it was 35%, right? The 30% of the workforce that didn't get laid off, that could work remotely, did. The question is that permanent? And is it permanent for students? The short answer is no, it's not permanent, and it's not permanent for good reason. And it's permanent for students either. It's telecommuting. Let's do the education part. Learning certain things by computer or online, from a book at home by yourself, watching a video lecture, which you could have done since the dawn of the first VHS and beta tape. So you can watch video lectures on a television since roughly the 1970s. And people have. So you could get a lecture, watch the lecture, which is, by the way, no different than watching it in Zoom, because if you have a class of 1,000 people, they're not really asking questions. I mean, they do mediate questions, but they're not. You listen to a lecture. It's basically broadcast. It's one way. So broadcast lecturing goes back to the dawn of radio, television, and VHS tape, and Betamax tape, which predates VHS. So, and it's fine. For certain things, you go to a class, we've all been to classes where you're not going to ask a question. You don't need to ask a question. There's not enough time to ask a question. The professor gives a lecture and you listen. And whether you were there in person or you're watching on a TV, probably doesn't matter a lot other than socializing, which is not nothing. So that kind of thing will accelerate. We'll do more of that. We started doing more of that when we've now given up on the expression. Remember, everybody talked about MOOCs. I mean, it was MOOCs, MOOCs.
I'm trying.
Massive online, what was C for? College or something. So the MOOC was the big thing when you could broadcast to 1 million people around the world the lecture from the favorite professor at MIT or Northwestern.
Right.
And it's free, right? And the internet makes it free, and it's great. And you can learn something that way. But there are a lot of things you can't learn that way. A lot of things are better off learned when you have the dynamic of a teacher can see whether you look puzzled or not puzzled, engage you. A lot of engineering and technical tasks, medical, a lot of the, we'll call it the softer tactile aspects of education can't be done that way. It's just literally impossible to do that way. I can't, if I'm teaching a medical student something, I can't palpate a patient that's real or a dummy, unless you want to give everybody a dummy. There's no mechanism to do that. So you end up with this bifurcated class of things that are amenable to Zooming or remote teaching. There's a lot. I don't know what percentage. If I were going to guess, let's just say half for sake of discussion. The other half is much better in person in terms of its efficacy of teaching. Then you layer in the question of what is the social value of commingling? A lot. And in teaching, it's the same as in business and innovation. the kind of things that people are able to learn, the kind of inspiration they get from an in-person lecture. It's really different. I mean, we both know, everybody that's listening knows, you've seen people who are really good on TV or really good on Zoom. But boy, in a lecture hall, they're just terrible. And vice versa. You've had professors or teachers that are electric in person. I mean, they're odd, they're quirky, all the things. Everybody's had an experience with that quirky prof, male or female. Is that your first impression is, oh, baby. And then you end up loving the class and you love the teacher because of the subtle pheromonal body language chemistry that goes on. And you learn more. You actually learn because you're attentive, you're paying attention. That's gone. So those things aren't going to come back anytime soon. Matt Ridley wrote a book, I think 10 years ago, about how innovation happens. He has a new book out now. But the book's basic thesis was that people innovate and companies find out the innovation of all kinds of discovery, all kinds of new ways of doing business when they're co-located, when they're working not on a screen like this, but physically co-located. In fact, he wrote a piece called Ideas Have Sex. And he was,
that's actually a great title. I like that a lot.
Great title. You can't have sex remotely. I'm not going to go there, but
yeah. And
you can't innovate as effective remotely. You have to be together. Now, how much of that matters? Well, a lot, actually. If you're a corporation, JP Morgan, I think, is already calling its employees back to work. IBM, a year before the COVID shutdown, canceled all the generous remote work policy, telling people that they need to go to work. Not that they can't remote occasionally, once a week, twice a week, go home early, but the full-time remoting was not working for innovation.
Yeah.
Why would, let's just say we have recorded history for roughly, 4,000 years. So for 4,000 years, we have a robust record of how people learn, how they innovate, how they cooperate, how they negotiate to avoid fighting in geopolitical wars. Showing up in person, doing it in person is profoundly important. But it's not that it's always critical. Once you've made the first contact or your teachers, you had the first lecture, maybe you can do the follow-ons on Zoom, maybe the supports on Zoom. So there's a blend. So this bifurcated either or. It's all going to be online. Schools are history versus Zoom is waste of time. It's obviously silly. It's going to be a blend. But even imagine, let's finish with education. And sorry for my rant. But
I think this is great because and we're going to talk a lot about education because I think it's a fascinating topic and you're hitting on all the points.
Yeah, and it's relevant, by the way, to skills training, the future of engineering, the future of science, the future of K through 12. But let's just use this model. Let's just say that 20%, I'll pick that if you do the combination of what can you teach remotely easily and productively and effectively, and what parts are important to have people show up for. But let's just say just 20% of the education could be done remotely now instead of effectively less than 1%. And online teaching is way under 1%. That's profound. I mean, you don't have to have it all switch. It would be in economic and structural terms for the universities and for K through 12, very much like what happened to the shopping mall because of e-commerce. We're going to have malls. People still like to go to physical stores for different things. I mean, it's not that we're never going to go to a physical store again. We need warehouses, which are versions of stores that you just don't go to. The Uber Eats goes to the store for you, but it's still a physical store. So you still need them. They have a different form. The same will be true in education. But if the shopping mall industry, pre-Amazon's visible disruption, which I would put it around the year 2000, nobody saw it as disruptive before 2010.
Yeah.
Before that, nobody cared. I mean, you buy books.
Yeah. It's not a big deal. They're not competing. Uber, they're not competing with cabs.
Yeah, they're losing money. What do you care? You carry on. But by the time Amazon was at 2% of retail in 2010 and growing rapidly, it was already disrupting the retail market. The retail market was overbuilt by, 5 or 10%. Not a lot. But once e-commerce took away 5 or 10% of their business, not a lot. The combination was a 20% overbuild in the physical structures of retail. Look what that did to the shopping mall. A 20% overbuild in any infrastructure is a calamitous. It really changes the game. So if my model at 20% of education, K through 12 and universities, could be effectively done this way, that's a big deal. There'll be a lot of universities going bankrupt. There'll be a lot of professors without jobs because I can use one prof to teach 50,000 people, and I can use a lot of Zooming and personal interaction, and frankly, some AI to clear and answer first order questions before I bump somebody up to a person. And is AI good enough for that? Yeah, it's almost not yet. I mean, it kind of sort of sucks still, but it's getting damn good, damn fast. As it gets better, and it will function as an intermediary, not as a teacher, to help accelerate that. So we'll see very significant changes that will be positive for consumers of education, make prices go down, negative for purveyors of education, they're overbuilt. They'll have to adapt, they will. For engineering schools, medical schools, I see nothing about Zooming being negative to them. In fact, it's all positive, because if everything that you would want that AI, virtual reality, and augmented reality do to help remote learning, they don't really push anything except the appetite to go in person. You still have to test your skills. But I do think that what this has done at the same time is accelerate, and this is why I think the 20% will happen. The fact that so many have done this and learned what I think people have intuitively learned what I've said, it's accelerated the appetite to invest in the new technologies that make remote haptic contact, a tangible internet, where we all know what haptics is. I think everybody knows what haptics is. It's where you could feel, I could touch the screen and feel a texture of something on the other side. I could look at you and reach out like this and see a VR image and touch your hand, and you and I would feel each other's hands shake. I mean, that is no longer science fiction or theoretical. The products that exist, I'd have to wear a glove, right, which would have sensors that would trick my nerves.
I've seen those where there's some, over the last 5 years or so on 60 Minutes, I think I've seen where you could control, and it wasn't necessarily for a surgeon, but a surgeon here could be doing work in the air and actually be controlling the machine that's doing whatever it was elsewhere.
That's two parts. There's gesture control, which already exists. Pixel phones now have a radar that gives you a gesture control. Kinetic from Microsoft, which is now in their HoloLens, is gesture control. So if I want to change screens here, I would do this. That's been around for a while. It's getting very, very good and very precise, which would allow you in a VR environment to grab the virtual reality thing and rotate it. What I'm talking about is adding to that the sense of touch, haptics, so that I can grab it and squeeze it. And as I squeeze it, I can feel the exact same pressure, force feedback, as if I were squeezing a real ball.
Well, and that ties back to that sex comment. Ideas can have sex if you have that. We're
not going there.
We're not there yet.
This
is a PG show. No, but I mean, so what I love about what you said, and actually it's very consistent with what Vicky Hollub said when she was on the show, which was, you know what? We sent everyone home for Oxy, and it was good, but the ideas and the matriculation and the culture. I mean, I really think about, there was an article written in HBR, and it was really impactful on me. I probably read it early in my career, so 2004, 2005, 15 years ago. And it said one of the highest reasons for retention at work is because you have a best friend at work.
Yeah, sure.
And you're so committed, and you become best friends because you've worked till 2 a.m. on a project, and you were selling a business or you were buying a business, and you have this intense connection. That Zoom is great. Zoom does a lot of good things, but
once you've made that connection, you can maintain it, you can nourish it with this kind of tool, but you can't create it that way. You can imagine you could use the extreme. People used to talk a lot about using SEAL training, warfighting training as analogs to how to train leadership and camaraderie in business, not to fight, but the analogies work, right? You fight.
Yeah, you're fighting a war, you're fighting a strategy. It's similar.
But you can't train a SEAL virtually, and you don't get the bonding amongst the team members because you're learning stuff online.
Yeah,
it's because you're together. But here's another thing we actually know physiologically. We actually know the neuropsychology, the neurochemistry, the neurophysics, that learning how your brain functions is directly linked to your hands, to your body function, to other senses. They're not independent. It's not like there's a bunch of buckets and I don't have any relationship in how my brain functions to learn something that's unconnected to the rest of my senses. They're fully connected. In some cases, profoundly connected. I mean, this, a trivial example, of course, is the extent to which writing something down helps you remember it more than typing it or just saying it, because that act, the motor skill act, wires it more permanently into the memory and the way the neurons function. It's utterly fascinating, and it's not something that is new in the sense that we're really discovering it. It's something we've known for a very, very long time, and now a lot of the techno enthusiasts. I'm a techno enthusiast, but I'm talking about the ones that I would unkindly call mouth breathers. They act as if none of the other lessons of history and science matter, that all of a sudden that's all old stuff. No, it's not.
Well, and so it's funny, and again, we started at Queens. We're talking about education. I think there's a lot of places we can go. But one of the reasons I chose Queens in 2006, and Queens had partnered with Cornell. So a lot of people ask why I have 2 MBAs. It was because I got one from Queens and one from Cornell. And I was very fortunate that Anadarko sponsored it so that I could work full-time during the week. And Queens had pioneered a technology which had teachers teaching from a studio lab in a very, very expensive lab. And they had, ways that you could engage at class, and they'd put multiple choice, or if you wanted to raise your hand. And it's amazing. It was basically Zoom technology 15 years ago. And we had 14 cities all over North America that all participated. But the key to why it was a success was that they understood that team building, and every business leadership book over the last 15 years of anyone who quotes is about, you can't be an individual contributor. It's about team. It's about teamwork. It's about building everything. And so what Queens did was they spent the first 2 weeks, you were in person. You did nothing but team building with your team. You were in person with your team every Saturday, all day long doing that. You traveled with your team. You did an international project with your team. And what it seems to me is, as we've done this pandemic, and certainly K through 12, they spent 6 months shut down thinking about how they were going to reimagine education. And they were worried about, well, someone might get sick and someone might show up, and we got to use the Zoom thing. But they never went to like the personal building. And when there's friction, which of course now parents, when you have a 6-year-old and they're coloring a purple penguin, the 6-year-old is not staying on Zoom all day long and then uploading their own material and then changing classes and then doing all this. So unless you're like 15, 16, 17, it doesn't actually work. And I would argue at 15, 16, 17, you're more interested in having 17 showers a day and texting with your friends than you are with, learning. So how does society actually do this hybrid model which you're talking about, which is there's some in person, there's some online, that will displace profs, that will displace universities, that will make meritocracy come back to education, maybe. It probably crushes the teachers union. How does all of that come together?
Well, with luck, this will depend a lot on how politics go in America in the coming years. I came here because I like this country. I mean, it's not that I just like my homeland. It depends on a lot of whether we let the market, and I literally mean that, all the 50 states work it out and try different ways and different models, because it's not obvious, to your point. I mean, you're basically saying it's not obvious how this is going to happen. It's not obvious at all. There are a lot of things that we all think might happen, and there's a lot of different opinions about how to affect this transition to making life a little different, or quote safer. I mean, I'm of the opinion, and this is we'll have to check back a year from now. I'm of the opinion that the hyper anxiety over infection will go away. Not that the coronavirus wasn't a serious disease, it didn't kill and hurt a lot of people.
Yeah.
But on the grand scale of things, in terms of the number of deaths that happened or that people think were possible, it doesn't merit the kind of destruction to the economy that actually happened. Now, I'm not making a judgment about what we did or why. I mean, I have opinions, but the fact is nobody really knew what was going on in early March, late February, clinically or otherwise. So people made the best decisions they could, and a lot of different decisions were made. So now we have 6 months of data to decide what was the right way. I mean, 6 months of data globally, because the whole world went crazy, to figure out what's the right response to the next novel virus, right? We now have data. And maybe if we're lucky, we'll learn what the data means and do something with that. I think we probably will. Meanwhile, educators are going to look at this and parents, and they're already doing this. I think the number is 20% of parents have opted to homeschool their kids rather than send them back to K through 12 in the fashion in which the school districts have told them they have to do it, because it's too chaotic for them. This kid can go for this day and that day, and you have to come back early and rotate. I mean, if you have a few kids, which let's just say you have two, maybe you just have one child, but that chaotic schedule, you said, you know, you just throw your hands up, you get the GED curriculum, you form a pod with some friends, and you teach your kids.
I totally agree. And
now I'm not saying you should do that, but 20% I think is a number. That's back to my 20% number. That's a tsunami, because you don't need a fraction of the teachers, to your point of the teachers. You don't need the buildings they've all overbuilt, because the baby boomlet is going to sort of be pulled down. In the end, I think my guess of what will happen is that this technology is getting better fast. It really is. Zoom keeps adding features. The two things that are missing from this are not in terms of talking and interaction. One of them is the scale of the images that most people have. Right?
Now explain that.
You have tiny pictures you're looking at of somebody else. Most people's screens are small. So if you think about, if you imagined that you had, I don't know what kind of screen you're on, a studio monitor, so I can watch, you know, a dozen people reasonably well, and 3 or 4 very comfortably because they're big images. If I have a huge monitor and it's cheap and it's super high resolution, cheap, huge video monitors, tiled monitors that go on the walls, those kinds of things profoundly change the efficacy of the communication, because it feels closer to natural. So that'll come. That's no longer could it be done. The idea, I don't mean like a single big screen, but the idea
but
is,
yeah, everyone, it's like the Avatar, the Avengers movie, where everyone was having a virtual meeting, and
we're all in the
like
same
science
room.
fiction. The perfect one would be the Microsoft HoloLens, where it would be more like VR, and it would look to you and I would look like we were holograms. That would be better. That'll eventually come too. It's technologically possible. How long does it take to get cheap so that it's in every home? I don't know. If I were picking a number, I'd say a decade. It's not the kind of technology that's going to get cheap overnight, but it's not going to take 20 to 30 years. And if it's a decade till it becomes available to lots of people, it's only a few years before it becomes available to a significant minority. And once you do that, I'm back to my Amazon model. Once I start getting to 2 or 3 or 4% of a market, and I'm on a digital trajectory of declining costs, changes a lot. And we can see the leading edge of this in the business you and I are involved in the oil and gas and the industrial markets. The medical and oil and gas, industrial training markets, these domains are the places where robots are going first, where VR and AR are going first, because the opportunity costs are, I mean, if you just think about the obvious thing, if it's a high-risk environment, it's a physically dangerous environment, anything I can do to improve training and minimize the number of times that a human being has to put themselves at risk, the costs can be much higher than for education. So they're early adopters, and we're seeing that already starting. In fact, Total was the first company, I think, maybe I will have to use the magic Google machine.
Love it. Top 3.
But they're one of the first companies to deploy Spot Mini on an offshore oil platform run by software that is remotely managed to do safety inspections, to enhance, to take away from an expensive employee. It's expensive to get employees to an offshore platform. Using that person to walk around in an environment that a wheeled robot can't go. Drones aren't very effective for a whole lot of reasons in that environment, if you imagine the physical complexity. So you have a walking dog that has thermal cameras and visual light cameras running AI in the background doing safety inspections. That kind of virtual environment transfer to back office is exactly the kind of technological sort of step that enables different kinds of training, different kinds of education, different kinds of experiences. That is, ironically, the Laggard Industry. And I sort of have a thesis, which I'll be writing about late this year or next year. The industry that everybody sees as the digital laggard, oil and gas, maybe turn out to be the early adopter of the next generation technologies that matter with respect to VR, AR, and robotics.
So it's interesting. So we started this conversation a little bit tongue-in-cheek with Elon and Gates and Zuckerberg and others dropped out of college. They also helped be on the cusp of innovation and early adoption that was generated outside of universities. But for the masses, it's the universities that are generally the early adopters of some of these technologies. So how do you, like, if you were giving advice to a kid, and you know, I have a 15 and 13-year-old, and back to everything that's been disrupted,
is you say, I would have said,
condolences to have two teenagers.
Oh my goodness. Well,
they're a lot of fun.
They're
fun.
They're amazing. They're amazing. But we talk a lot about university. And I would have said a year ago, and certainly when I was a kid, my wife, when she said that she was going to take a gap year and go to Europe, which was kind of a thing in the 90s, her dad said, "You're more than welcome to do that, but I will not be paying for your education." To which she promptly was at school in September. And yet, we've seen with coronavirus and the way that everyone's life could be disrupted, that you kind of go, do we really need to rush through? And is an 18 or 19-year-old who's just getting out on their own and just learning to socialize, are they really in the right place to really absorb it? And I'll say from doing my MBA, when I did my engineering degree, I did well, but I didn't do nearly as well as I would have done, because when I did my MBA, I knew I had limited time. I had kids, I was traveling, I was working. When I had to study, there was zero procrastination. When I had to write a paper and I got it done and I was efficient, and that was an age thing. And so I'm curious how you think that if you were recommending parents now and you look at university and drop out, do go, don't go, how do you think about that as an educator?
Well, I'm not really an educator, although I guess what I spend my life doing, talking and writing.
You're an educator. I mean, you give of your time to educate others on concepts they might not know.
If I was giving a conference or a speech, you have to pay for my time. But that's other than that, I'm not giving it away. I think
that's fair.
It's many decades learning stuff and figuring out things. You want to get paid something.
Yes.
It's like giving away oil, although I'm sure guys in the gas fields feel like they're giving away the gas.
Yeah, you better believe
You literally are. It's a good question. I mean, the obvious answer is so hyper dependent on the student, on the child, that there is no. I mean, there's a spectrum for all students and all people, where some kids are just fine going right to university, and they're made for that. They're natural students. They like studying, and they do well in that environment. Just help them go as fast as possible and feed it. Then there are other kids, as you know, our friends, family, who are convinced they have to go to university because they'd look like a dope if they didn't. But they really don't want it. Their heart's not in it. They don't study that hard. They don't like studying. Doesn't mean later they don't decide, I was being dopey. My forebrain didn't kick in. I probably should have studied harder. I should have been an engineer, or I should have studied English. I should have done all the woulda, coulda, shouldas, right? Very common. So if you're looking at your child as they're maturing, obviously, I mean, my parental advice I took from my father and my in-laws, and thinking about raising kids, is that you're trying to figure out who and what they are, and take the rough edges off them, because everybody has rough edges, and put sort of boundaries around their behaviors that are destructive or stupid. But they can't be too narrow, the boundaries, because you can't steer. If you got a kid that's going this way, you got to put the boundaries like this. If you got another kid going this way, you just can't steer them over there. If you try, not so good, right? Yeah. It doesn't mean, I'm not talking about disciplinary stuff. I'm talking about the intellectual.
Yeah, what their core love is.
I mean, my core love is oil and gas. It always was. It's data.
Well, yeah.
It's actually data, if you're totally honest. Data is my true love.
Well, I like to figure out how things work. I always have. So data matters there. But if you think about what it means, and really to answer your point directly, I would recommend to you, if you haven't read it, a book by my friend Rich Carlgard called Late Bloomers.
Okay.
He published it last year. He's publisher now. I think he's editor at large for Forbes, but brilliant guy. I mean, he really is a very perceptive guy about people and trends. In fact, his last book on teams, which you haven't read, you should read, because he tried to figure out what's the optimal team size for businesses, for the military. And this is very robust, again, behavioral and psychiatric.
I'm gonna guess. I haven't read it. I read a number of articles in HBR that says that direct reports and direct teams should be 7.
It's numbers in those range. You know, you can do a little smaller, a little bigger, but exactly. But there's a reason for that. He digs into why it's that number. It has to do with human psychology and relationships. But his book on late bloomers is interesting because it gets, what animated him, it's what he said to me, and I hope I'm getting it right, is really the question you have. We've got an education system pre-coronavirus that it's been driven by getting the kids to the best possible schools, studying the most, get the grades, get the job with a Goldman or Google or, I don't know, Exxon. Exxon's now day class A, I know, but it used to be a company people wanted to work for. But whatever it is, you know, as a parent, you're feeling anxious if they aren't performing, and you get the tutoring, and if you can't get, it just boom, boom, boom. Okay, most kids it doesn't work out so well for, they're not happy. Some kids it works out fine for. And so what about the kids that are not cut out for that? What if they're the kids that are late bloomers? What if the ones that either clinical reasons that forebrain development is later for some, forebrain meaning connecting today's behavior to future consequence, is slower in males than it is in females on average. It's much slower in some males. Some girls figure out that what you do in the present affects the future basically when they're 10 or 11. Some males never figure it out till they're well in their 20s.
Right.
And that profoundly affects what they do when they choose to study or not study. So what do? Well, okay, maybe you figure out that this is not a child you send to a 4-year college. Maybe they do something, you know, like Teach for America. Maybe they do some volunteer work overseas. Maybe they take a trade. Maybe they go to community college. You know, sort of think about it. But the trick that Rich writes about, and that you and I both know, is that the culture doesn't support that. So he documents all the people who are late bloomers, not just educationally, but started a career and start a new one later because they didn't like their being a lawyer, or women who leave the workforce to raise their children. They want to come back in the workforce and discover, boy, the workforce is not very friendly to that, and it really isn't, despite all the progress that we've made. Yeah. Remind me, are we in progress or progress in America?
Well, you know what? I go with either, but yes, the Canadian and American version is different.
I forgot. I guess can't remember.
And I asked Vicky about that. To dive into the woman thing, is that really the COVID pandemic is going to be a bit of a recession on women, because whatever progress we did in fact make, getting women back in the workforce, rightly or wrongly, especially when the younger kids are there and right. Women, you know, we're just not as attentive with the kids. I love my kids and I'm great at coaching them in hockey and golfing with them and playing with them, but like making sure they do their homework and feeding them and stuff, that was just not my thing.
I think everybody's shocked to learn that a Canadian is coaching.
I know. What an incredible shock.
But so therefore, like,
the burden shifting happened in families, in the nuclear family, more to the women, which take them out of their career, which then when they come back, even after making progress, they have to take a step back. And I asked Vicky about that, and she talked about diversity, etc. But there's no easy answer. And when things disproportionately fall on women, or, you know, if you don't have opportunity, if you don't have a high-speed internet connection for your kids, you can't have them learn like this, right. And they're going to be left behind. If you have money, you've probably pulled your kid out of school and sent them to a different thing that's specifically for them, whereas public school is built around the average kid.
But
it's fascinating.
But the answer to the question you asked earlier, you implicitly answered with those observations about how's this going to evolve, how are we going to see it evolve? Well, we already know that we're not very many years away from ubiquitous, low-cost, high-speed connectivity blanketing the world. That's between Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. I think they're going to have, I forgot the number. I'm going to put this in my guesstimate remember range: 20 to 30,000 satellites each in low Earth orbit to provide a ubiquitous blanket of not Wi-Fi, but essentially Wi-Fi the planet.
Yeah.
So now there's no question of what your income level is. You have high speed internet connection, and you're going to, you know, you can imagine before long you're going to see what I would call a Zoom appliance, just like the Chromebook. If what you really need is just a connection to this, all the other functionality in the computer you're not using because all the word processing is in the cloud. So I basically need a voice interaction, a microphone, a keyboard, maybe. I don't even need a physical keyboard. I can project keyboards. You know, you can buy virtual keyboards today. So all that gets cheaper constantly. Connectivity gets cheap. So the barrier to bringing not only Zoom-like stuff, but even more effective, the tangible gesture internet, the haptic internet, all that is increasingly going to be cheap and available. What that means is that women who choose to stay home, this is already happening, or men that choose to stay home. We actually have a friend whose wife was the higher earner, given her new job opportunity, said, I'll work part-time from home. I mean, that's more common.
And that's good economics. That's just great economics.
It's more common now than it was obviously 30 years ago. But your ability to do that or re-enter the workforce or get retrained or requalified. I mean, imagine for whatever reason you've been home or you've been laid off and you want to get requalified and retrained. Obviously, online learning makes that profoundly easier than having to go to a campus somewhere, and cheaper. And even if the campus, for team building purposes, wants you there for a week or two, you could manage that, but you can't manage the 3 months. So I think the technology is getting better enough, fast enough that you could argue that it's no longer going to be it's what's held it back up until now. What's going to happen now is the principal metric that will determine the velocity of adoption of these things will be behavioral, regulatory, cultural. I mean, those features. So as people begin to decide that they want to do it, it won't be, can I afford it? I mean, I'll give a simplistic example. When the telephones first became available, they were very expensive. Only rich people had them. Once they became cheap, and they became cheap fast, then the social and cultural changes that the telephone brought weren't driven by people making decisions because they afford a phone.
Yeah,
they got the phone.
Yeah, and then the phone became, which is, if I'm going to paraphrase two things that you said. Number one is that there's a lot of negatives that come out of COVID and a lot of controversy and a lot of data, and we're going to make a decision. But what it did do, similar to Amazon in 2010, is it's so disruptive to education that all of a sudden we had 10 years of natural evolution occur in 6 months, and the results of people all making different decisions that were not like, well, I was told to go to school and I can't homeschool and I can't do this and things shouldn't be online and there's not going to be class vouchers for me to move my money around. And all of a sudden, all of that's out the window. So COVID probably is going to have the single biggest impact long-term on the way we educate, both locally and internationally with this Wi-Fi global thing.
I would say yes, with two caveats. First, that's only because it occurred, this particular pandemic occurred contemporaneous with the maturation of the technologies. If this COVID happened 20 years ago, it wouldn't have mattered. Secondly, you're hearing everybody saying this changes everything. It's a common phrase in COVID times. Yeah, what a load of hooey. Nothing changes everything except an asteroid hitting the Earth, and that changes everything. I mean, a big asteroid.
Yeah.
So that ended the dinosaurs. It could end humanity. But other than that, no single thing changes everything. And you don't have to change everything. I'll come back to my point. All you have to change is 10 or 20% of the marketer behaviors and start at changing only a few percentage points on the way to 10 points. It's a big deal. So I think what we'll see is some structural changes that are very significant in education. And the big deal part of it has unintended consequences. I wrote, again, I'm self-referencing, but back
that's when you do the research to write a book, which we're going to talk about, you get to self-reference all you want.
So back when the COVIDs were first attacking the world and we shut down and oil used to collapse 30%, to speak to the issue you and I know a fair bit about. And we had people saying, well, that's it. That's the end of commuting and oil demand's going to stay in the tank forever. We're done. So, I think about it. All right, that seems stupid on the face of it, but 30% destruction in oil demand has never happened. Didn't happen in World War II. So if you look at a graph, and you can find this, the IEA has it, there's other graphs, from the dawn of the oil age in the late 1800s to date, there's never been a 30% destruction in oil demand, including in World War II. So, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, what happens next? So I wrote that what happens next is there'll be more telecommuting, not in the short term, but in the long term. And does that mean, and people will stay afraid to fly for a while. After 9/11, people were afraid to fly for 3 years.
3 years, yeah, I was going to say.
So I figure, I mean, the airlines know this. Would it be longer than 3 years? Well, okay, maybe it's 4. Maybe faster than 3, maybe it's 2. But 3 years is probably a good number to guess with now. That's consequential. Airlines consumed 10 million barrels of oil a day January. In March, they consumed 1 million barrels a day. So they took 9 million barrels off the market. That's a lot. But in a 100 million barrel world, that's not 30%. So it went somewhere else. It's cars, it's businesses. And then it bounced back.
Ships,
the V curve started to come back. So the question would be, specifically with respect to telecommuting, use my scenario, assume that half of the 30% can telecommute regularly, and that the share of full-time telecommuting goes from 5%, where it was in January, that January 2021 is the new normal. It's 10% low teens. It doubles, to your point. We did 20 years of telecommuting growth in 1 year. Okay, what will that do? Well, if you take 10% of the traffic off the roads of Houston or Austin or Washington, D.C. or L.A., traffic flows much better. It's a profoundly nonlinear effect.
Yeah.
So commutes for those who have to commute will get better. But then you get a couple of weird things. You get the rebound effect in 2 domains in telecommuting. After a while, people who are going to work are having a good time or socializing. Eventually, they're going back out to lunch again without wearing face diapers and all this stuff. And the guys are at home and thinking, hey, the gals kind of miss. So they realize the commute's easy. Their neighbor says, it used to take 45 minutes to get to work. I'm doing it in 28 now. So they get on the road. You know what that means.
Yeah.
Simultaneously, if you do the research, I didn't know this factoid. There's been a lot of research on this. So what percentage of people's driving is commuting? Because if you want to figure out the oil impact
good one.
of telecommuting, how much first you do this is the cascade.
I'm going to go 30%.
You're close. You're not bad. You're not as low. It's actually 20%.
Well, I went naturally. Wow, but yeah, I mean, you think about driving your kids. I feel like I'm a 5-star Uber driver, and I do 10 times more driving to get my kids to the things they need to get to than I ever did to go to work.
1950s and 60s, the percentage of road miles, 50% were involved in commuting. It's now way under half that. It's 22%.
Wow.
So if you take oil used by transportation, and then which is about 60%, oil used by light duty vehicles, which is less than half of that, and then oil used by commuting, and then the percent that are going to telecommute that didn't you end up taking it out of the U.S. market if we get a tripling of telecommuting permanently. That is, never go to work, never commute. You get 1 million barrels per day of demand destruction out of a market that's, as you know, 20 million barrels per day. Not nothing, but it's not the end of oil demand. More important, what a lot of surveys have shown over the last decade is that as people telecommute or work from anywhere, WFA, or instead of work from home, because a lot of people don't want to be at home. They go to the Starbucks, they go to the park. So it's work from anywhere.
They go to WeWork, which used to be a good business idea, and now is.
So what happens is a certain cohort of the population, total driving miles go up. They actually drive more when they're working from anywhere than when they went to work. And if you sort of think through the logic of how you live your life, what you might do, maybe you drive somewhere you'd rather work, you do some errands you would otherwise not have done, you may go play hockey to take a break, you might, whatever. But those behavioral rebounds are what happens in the real world. So that could neuter a significant amount of these, quote, savings from not commuting. It might even, in some markets, lead to a net increase in demand because the propensity to move into the suburbs or exurbs means that the people who are doing that, moving further away from the city, have to drive further for the things that are non-commuting activities.
So you are a non-peak oil theorist, which I think is for those who listen to the show, which is where we're going to talk now on oil and gas, is I think that is a refreshing change from all of the this changes everything folks that say that this is peak oil demand. I would have said that when the United States is 300 million people out of 7.8 billion, which is 5% of the planet's population, right, we consume 20% of the planet's oil,
Right.
there is no way that the rest of the world is not going to continue to grow their oil use, especially when you give opportunities for education and Wi-Fi and internet and commercial activity.
Sure.
So I am with you. I am not a peak oil theorist at all, and it sounds like neither are you.
Yeah, I was a certified member of the opposition on peak supply and peak oil back in the early 2000s. In fact, you may recall the book I co-authored called The Bottomless Well.
I was going to talk to you about that.
Yeah. So in that book,
now I have the full title here because it's not just that. It's a great title. The Bottomless Well, the Twilight of Fuel, the Virtue of Waste, and Why We Will Never Run Out of Energy.
I think that's a great title.
Yeah, it was so none of our predictions failed, I dare say, in the book, because we didn't make any predictions based on politics in that book, but based on basic engineering, physics, and economics. The economic principles being markets want cheaper energy. They just don't like to pay more for commodities. Which any producer knows. Now, you could game the system temporarily, and the temporary could be decades, where the government gives people that make more expensive products a subsidy because there's a political, social, moral, economic reason to do that. But it never sustains itself unless a thing gets cheap, because over time, markets want the things that sustain it that are commodities to be free. We want food to be cheap. We want water to be cheap. We don't want the
content to be cheap.
Nobody likes to pay for
news or
content or anything. We want everything free.
So it's the nature of markets. But the peak supply idea was always silly. And it was silly for a very simple reason. The construct that was made then, and it's the same construct that exists today, is that, oh, wait a minute, oil is limited, it's fossil fuel, gas is limited. Question is, what's the limit? Limit is the physical, geophysical resource. I don't mean, some things have limits. We're talking about where's the boundary. But more important than that, it's not, is it limited by its fundamental resource? Oil costs money, it's limited, but wind and sun are unlimited and they're free. That's the construct. That's why we started 45 years ago with this idiot federal policies to spend billions of dollars, maybe a collective trillion of federal money to avoid using oil, minimize the use of oil, and save oil and gas. And find alternatives to oil and gas. A complete waste of money. Just utter travesty and a waste of capital. Wind and solar, water, oil, gas, and coal are all free. All of them. No human being created them. Where they exist is free. In order to make those resources into something useful, you have to do exactly the same thing for everything. You have to get access to land where it usefully exists. That always costs you money, both money in a regulatory sense and money because you have to pay whoever owns the land to get access to it. Then you have to build machines with materials to tap the energy to get access to it and convert it to a useful form. This is true for all energy sources. So the only thing you care about supplying energy to humanity are those costs. Where are the things, and what are the costs for where they are? Where's the wind and sun? Where the sun is, it matters. Obviously, the sun's everywhere. It's not as usefully there in the Arctic as it is in the equator. Where is the wind that's useful? Where is the oil that's useful? Useful meaning the cheapest to get to, closest to get the product to market. And then how much stuff do I have to build at what cost? And how long does that stuff last, which is a cost feature? And then when it wears out, what do I do with the stuff? Because when stuff wears out, it's junk. The idea of a closed cycle, complete recycling is bunk, right? The world recycles the net about 6% of the materials we extract from the planet. 6%. Right. It's true we recycle like 90% of lead, but for all the other stuff, nothing. So that tells you why the idea that oil is limited is just silly. But demand side, you put your finger on it. Is there a peak demand? Well, if governments order a peak demand and tell you can't use it, sure, of course. But if you let markets function and ask what do people want to do, they'll want to buy cars. They'll want to fly places eventually. They'll want to build things. And it's impossible not to use oil in that market.
So there's so much interesting, and it all comes back to the education, because, you know, as you're talking about regulatory policies, federal policies, governments for 40 years have been putting money into wind and solar. And you and I would be both proponents of the world needs energy, and when the market works, we make it as cheap as possible. Then you think about externalities, and for some reason the environmental movement thinks that burning trees and planting new ones is a good thing, but taking coal and planting an equivalent number of trees for the coal would be a bad thing. And it seems like, is it a failure of our education system that we don't talk about the economics of life and the economics of business and the way the world is, built around trade-offs? Like, I think Seinfeld had a joke on one of his specials that was like, there's long-lasting or fast-acting cough syrup. There isn't long-lasting and fast-acting. So you got to pick which one you want, but it's a trade-off.
And it seems to me we've totally forgot about the trade-offs in the world.
Well, I would, in the broadest sense of the word, it's an education problem. But put differently, it's a lack of curiosity problem. It's a political problem. It's a lack of information problem. So I'm not sure we want to teach kids those facts. I think we want to teach students of all ages how to be curious, how to learn, to recognize that when you're told something, there's a way you can get information, but mostly it's how to develop a process of inquiry and a process of critical analysis, so that when somebody says something to you, you can have like a BS detector. But in the kind of hyper politicized environment that we're in now, it's not entirely new. I mean, it feels kind of new because it's a little different.
It's the first time it's ever been like this. This changes everything, Mark.
Exactly. And the thing that, some things are new. I mean, AOC is a different person than the firebrands of the 1980s when I worked for Reagan. But, the dynamic's the same. But when it comes to energy, I did, I think you probably saw it, I did a PragerU video, which is unbelievably difficult, highly reductionist demand in 5 minutes. So we're going to talk for like over an hour. In 5 minutes, you've got to say something meaningful that you can defend later, right? That everybody feels is true, but is impactful. And what I did the 5 minutes on was the externalities of wind and solar. Not that wind and solar don't work. Of course they work. And not that they're not inexpensive for certain applications. Of course they are. And not that they don't have value. We'll use a lot more of it. Of course we will. I didn't say any of that because you don't want to chew up minutes in the video. But once you make the decision to say, well, we should stop using oil, gas, and coal and use just wind and solar, or we should subsidize wind and solar to the detriment of penalizing wind, then you have to ask, you should be responsible enough to say, well, is there any consequences to that? We know what we're being told. The consequence is, well, we'll cut carbon dioxide emissions. Well, possibly. Some cases, not. In some cases, what happens is the fuel cycle to manufacture the equipment involves using oil-fired machines, or coal-fired electricity in Asia to build the hardware we buy. Something like 85% of all solar panels in America are manufactured in Asia. Asia's grid is about 60% coal-fired. These are electrically intensive processes to make them. So when the solar panel arrives in America, it comes with what you might call a carbon burden. So the carbon dioxide the panels don't emit then, instead of burning natural gas, say in a gas turbine, takes years before it pays its, quote, debt of the burden it brought. And eventually it pays its debt. It's not like it doesn't pay it, but it takes time. Batteries, most of which are made, except for Elon Musk's, in Asia, also are similarly electric intensive and oil and gas intensive and coal intensive. And when they arrive in an electric car, they bring a carbon burden too. Huge one, in fact. So big that batteries made in Asia, put in cars driven in America, charged on the average grid in America, never repay the carbon debt. They are a net increase in carbon dioxide added to the atmosphere. So, I mean, that's noble. So you could say, well, I'll fix that. We'll make sure all electricity is wind and solar. Well, okay, fair enough. But you're importing the solar panels. We don't make them here. And they say, well, we'll make them here. All right, we can subsidize the industries or stop punishing them. where are you going to get the selenium, the silver, the gold, the cadmium? Let's just go down the list of the minerals. If you're making batteries, of course, as you know, we need to get lithium carbonate. We have to get nickel. The quantity of minerals required for the green path is epic. On average.
Yeah, they don't like the oil sands open mining. Wait till they see lithium open mining.
Well, you can use the magic Google machine under images, and you can see lithium mines. Well, here's a simple fact: like all electric cars use roughly twice as much copper per car as an internal combustion engine. So as you convert the car fleet to electric, you double the use of copper in that market. It's a significant market. It's not the biggest, but it'll become one of the bigger ones. Use the magic Google image machine and go look at open pit copper mines around the world and look where copper's mined. I don't mind them. Actually, I worked for a Canadian mining company. I worked for Eldorado Nuclear back in the day. Had mines in the Northwest Territories. Was uranium, silver, and gold miner. I think we should mine more in America, frankly, but the environmentalists don't support that. In fact, the policy paper I did on this, more self-promotion.
I love it though. I mean, you are, and I said this for people at the beginning.
If you don't follow Mark, I mean, he has done so much and thinks so much. And honestly, like, these are the thinkers that, quite frankly, I would love to see in politics. But the thinkers who are spending their time thinking like you do are like, I don't want to have to deal with the C students yelling at me for not doing open pit mining in North America.
I'm not going to go into politics, but I do meddle in it by being testifying occasionally. But if we want more batteries, windmills, and electric cars, we ought to be honest that it requires more mining, that we're switching from a liquid fuel to a solid fuel, because you need energy minerals in both cases. You need the minerals to build the solar arrays, the wind turbines, the batteries, and you're doing that instead of drilling for oil. Fair enough. If that's a decision you want to make, just be aware of what the decision you're making, what it costs. And if you do that, why not require that for every dollar of subsidy going into green stuff, that requires a pound more of minerals to be mined in North America. So why don't we bring the mining back here?
Yeah.
We get the mining jobs here. Don't be importing these minerals and stuff. Not because you shouldn't import anything. I'm actually a reflexive free trader. I think globalization is on balance good. It's not good when it happens because we drive our businesses out of here. So if we destroy our oil and gas industry because we punish it, the world will still produce oil and gas.
Oh, yeah.
We'll still consume it. We'll just import it. We'll just drive the guys and gals that are good at that industry, if they want to stay in it, they'll go work in the Middle East.
They'll work for Saudi Aramco, where they have a 53-year reserve life index.
Or you could go work at South American fields. Argentina would be happy if we did that.
Yeah. No, I mean, and again, it's all great education, and the Google machine puts at the tips of our fingers, for those who are curious, a mechanism by which that they can research rather than be fed a narrative.
But you have to ask the right question.
Very,
very fair.
And you also have to, and this is true, whether it's Google or any other search engine, although Google dominates. We all know this, whether you're checking for medical advice, what does that SOAR really mean? Or when Mills said this, is it true? So you'll get some politically driven, fact-driven website that says, in fact, I found one. I try not to look at them. Mills is a shill for the oil industry. Well, I've given speeches to the oil industry and briefed their boards. I've done the same in the grain industry, and I was a CEO for a while of a lithium battery company. I mean,
we had to have a career because you need to pay for shit, and smart people tend to get good jobs.
But check the facts. Don't just dismiss it by saying you're a shill. What about when I state a fact, for example, that to fabricate a battery that could hold a barrel of oil's worth of energy, that quantity of energy, you have to consume 100 barrels of oil equivalent of energy to make that one battery. That's a lot of energy. So you have to believe that battery is going to save you a lot of energy over the years you use it to repay that energy debt. It takes energy to make everything. My point is, the battery is not a source of energy, it's a storage tank. So I've just, instead of having a steel storage tank, which takes ounces of energy to make, I now have replaced it with a storage tank that takes 100 barrels of oil of energy to make, and I'm using it because I'm saving energy. I mean, that's savings. Well, okay, do the math. Do you save enough to pay that debt back?
But then I don't like what you're saying, so I'm going to say that's false information.
Sure.
I mean, I'm gonna
ban you on LinkedIn for that.
Yeah, I know. We're in that kind of environment. It's not new. I mean, I think the tech companies run a very dangerous game, very high risk. And I think they're aware of this. These are not stupid people. That let's just do the two extremes, right? They really should try to police their content for really despicable, disgusting pornography and child trafficking.
Yeah.
Who would object?
No one would object to that. Not a single person.
Policing, it's a gray zone, but let's just say there's a role for and people who are genuinely, terrorists, let's say. At the other extreme, you've got the concern that in the political domains that they're policing it for somebody saying something they don't like or disagree with because it's a policy matter. Let's say about climate or about plastic straws,
or in my case, COVID.
Whatever, COVIDs. You can't talk about masks without being censored, which happened to Atlas, right? One of the White House's positions, and it's pretty shocking because, okay, you could reasonably say, if you're the manager of the platform, here's some other information you could look at. I don't mind encouraging people to get other information, but censoring people, very high risk if you're a private business, because you never know how the politics are going to go in this. And when you end up becoming regulated, the ultimate power here is the government. The government has a lot of power.
Yeah. So yeah, you strike me as someone who reads a lot. Would you credit your general interest in knowing how things work, that you dig in and that's built a reading habit? Or is it the vice versa, that you read a lot of things which makes you more inquisitive about the things you don't know? You know what they say, sort of like, I forgot more than I know, or there's something along like, the more I learn, the more I know I don't actually know as much as I thought I knew. So what's your views on books and reading and education for yourself and continued learning?
Well, I do read a lot, but the important thing to do is also talk to people who know things that are smart. So you try to do both. If you want to meet and talk to people who are domain knowledgeable, or if they're not domain knowledgeable, they're smart people. They do their own reading. So it's an easy thing to say. It's very difficult to practice. At least it is for me. Is you want to listen to people who are, even if you don't agree with them, who are smart and have given serious thought to a subject, because you might learn something. And that is it's a loop. Obviously, reading is important. If you don't develop a habit of doing research and reading, you don't learn anything. I would say one interesting piece of information about the psychology of learning and reading that my wife found in a book on clinical psychology. She does a lot of reading in that area and studies there. It turns out that people who only read fiction or only read nonfiction aren't as effective at, we'll call it, the expression ideation, innovation, come up with fresh new ideas.
Yeah.
How your brain functions when you read a novel is different than how it functions when you read a nonfiction book for facts. And a cohesive narrative construct that stories have develop a part of your brain that's critical to doing discovery. Because discovery is typically a story. If people think of the discovery when Einstein discovered X, it's not that it was like boom, this thought came into his head that he got the Nobel Prize for the photoelectric effect. For those who don't know that, that's what his Nobel Prize was for, not for relativity. It's because there was a narrative developing, a story about what matter was made of, what photons were, and that narrative has to have a whole construct to it. The part here has to tie to the part there. That's very different than reading a fact-filled book. You don't get a narrative in a fact-filled book. The narrative development comes from reading fiction. So the advice of this particular researcher and educator was you hear a lot of scientists and engineers say, I never read fiction, right? A lot of fiction really isn't so good, but it doesn't matter if it's so good or not. There's actually if you tell somebody, there's actually a benefit to you to develop your brain to be better at your day job, let's call it, by reading fiction. Now, reading is different than watching, but it's you know, it's not that watching a good story on Netflix or Prime is a complete waste of time. It's the same brain engagement if it's a well done kind of storyline, because you have to engage the story. Clearly, if you go more into what amount to video games on the screen that are just animated, you know, Avengers stuff, sometimes there's a storyline. In fact, as you well know, the movies that are in that category that are essentially, you know, goofy fiction, we'll call it, that are classic stories do better. Star Wars, if you dissect it as a clinician, is a classic Greek novel. I mean, it's a classic story, love interest, evil, ties it all together. So, and it was extraordinarily popular in a significant measure because people love stories, the narrative. It's a long way of saying, yeah, reading matters a lot. I read, I wouldn't say omnivorously, because I like mystery novels. I like, you know, whodunits. I like science fiction, but I haven't found much good science fiction lately. There's some new authors that are great. And then I read history, and I read technology history in particular. And I try to read books, I say try, by people who I disagree with about where computers or robots are going, or energy, looking for new ideas.
Yeah, it is amazing that you learn more from the opposite idea and either grounding yourself in what you believe or taking their fact, which, as you said in that 5-minute blurb, is so different than what you'd thought. You're like, whoa, 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 whoa. I'm going to need to go to the Google machine and check this out. Or you said other people use different things. I obviously use Ask Jeeves still. Yeah. Great search engine. If you could go back and interview yourself 30 years ago and give yourself some advice that you think would have accelerated maybe your career or caused it to go in a different way or something, what would you give yourself as advice 30 years ago that you think would be impactful today?
Spend less, save more. The most important life advice you get as you get older is that when you're young, you make a little more money. It's fun to spend it and buy stuff and do things. But the compound value of savings is astonishing. So, you know, Dave Ramsey, he has a whole show on this stuff. Yeah. And one of my sons is a huge fan of his. But I say that because it is relevant to education and learning and career, because the optionality you will have, one has in one's life, to choose to do something different. Let's just say you work for an oil company, you'd love to go, I don't know, start a restaurant, or vice versa. Your optionality to make a change in your life is very much dominated by whether you can afford to do it. If you're part of the 1% where you have enough money, where these decisions are not driven by finances, your parents can finance it for you. You don't have to work for an employer that pays for your MBA. You just go, you quit work. That really literally is the 1% or a few percent. And that doesn't tell you very much for most of humanity. So most people, I would say, being frugal and being sensible when you earn extra money, so you buy yourself options later. The other obvious one is, is to take your life seriously without being over serious. I mean, when you think about your career, it's serious business that you're engaged in because it's your life. So you should take it seriously. You shouldn't be casual about making decisions, which is not being an over-serious person. You can be a funny person or have fun. By that I mean, you might work for a boss that's really, a jerk, or other words that would describe them. But it's really a good job. They're a jerk, but they're not being unfair to you in a way that's damaging your career. They're not being predatory. They're just a jerk. You don't like them. Think hard about leaving that job if it's the right job for career development. Doesn't mean you should stay there forever, but don't be emotionally impetuous. When you're younger, you tend to be a little more emotional, reactive. Tend to be. I mean, a lot of older people do the inverse. They become crotchety, impetuous, and just really embarrassing and to be around. You don't want to hang out with them. So that's a long answer.
No, I love that. And so I'll test this because I've always told people I treated my career like I was a professional athlete. And so a lot of my friends growing up, and someone we'll have on the podcast in the next couple of weeks, was a professional NHL hockey player for 20 years. And our society supports athletes. They train during the summer. They do everything. When we would have them over during the season for dinner, like he had no booze, only this, had to do this, stretching, had to be home by 8:30. And I, as a squash player, which isn't, a real professional sport you can make any money at, but it was really fun to travel. I treated my oil and gas career like I was a professional athlete, and I was going to be the best oil and gas professional that there could be. And I was going to take every opportunity to grow my career. I was going to work all the hours. I was going to stay in. I was going to take the courses. I was going to do everything. I was going to talk to everyone. And that is what I credit as being the reason that I was able to be successful, was because I didn't just kind of bumble around being like, well, maybe my career will work out and maybe it won't. I treated it like I was a professional athlete. And now I get to do podcasts because I did that for 20 years.
Yeah, that's why sports, as you know, it's why you want to get kids involved in sports. It's not because they're going to become professional athletes. Most don't, but it's a great discipline. And of course, back to where we started when I was saying that school involves people and kids being together. It includes sports. The reason the Greeks had students do sports and the Romans did, and we throughout all history, it's not because sports in and of themselves they're fun, but they have a role in developing your reflexes and how you approach things, how you plan, how you collaborate, how you train. And it's the form of forebrain, where doing something that's not fun now gives you a reward later. I mean, you say you can't make a lot of money in squash. So you will know this as a fellow having spent some time in the great cold retarded giant of the North. Everywhere but in the United States, badminton is actually an Olympic aggressive racket sport, not hit and giggle in the backyard. So after I got out of school and I was trying to do some sports that I could continue in life, and I was a gymnast, so you can't really do gymnastics in any business, and not in your backyard. And besides which, it's impossible to do it once you get a little bit older.
Yes,
so I started playing badminton, which was to the great amusement of almost everybody who learned that when I came to the United States, because it sort of hit and giggle. I said, guys, the fastest object that's ever moving in a racket sport is a badminton bird when it comes off of the racket in a smash. It's incredibly fast, demanding, it's strategic like tennis and squash.
Oh, it's a glorious sport.
But it looks goofy. And so I don't play it anymore.
Oh, well, it's
too bad. I grew up in Calgary, and as a squash player, our courts were right beside the badminton courts. Exactly. And we would always be training and we'd always be pushing, and I was always amazed. I mean, the badminton players and the squash players were the best athletes at the club, and the figure skaters and the curlers can take that. So, Mark, I mean, you're a fascinating person, and the reason I do the hot take of the day is to create people's inquisitiveness so that they will go and investigate a lot of the topics. And in the 75 minutes we spoke, there's probably 30 things that I think people can research. There's books. Where can people find you or follow you, or where do you show up most in life that people would interact with you?
On the magic interwebs? Well, if you type my name with a P, Mark P. Mills, in the magic Google machine, or I pop up a lot of places, unfortunately. The website, which has most of my canon of writing, some links to some video stuff, is tech-pundit.com. So if you tech-pundit, pundit.com, that has all the, pretty much most of what I've written in columns, reports, books. My last book was called Digital Cathedrals, published January this year, a short book by, 80 pages. You can read it on a flight when you get to fly again. And it's about the new infrastructure of the internet. It's not about, I write about energy in that as well. What I write about is in the physics of information, energy turns out the reduction in the consumption of energy per logic operation is the whole goal in the entire internet ecosystem. The irony is you reduce the amount of energy you need per unit of information. The aggregate quantity of energy consumed by information balloons. So now the world's global ecosystem in data and bits uses roughly as much energy as the global aviation did in January 2020. We know what happened to global aviation. The digital cathedrals, as I call them, keep expanding and growing. So, but anyway,
I love it.
About that.
I'm gonna get all those books, because I think keeping the mind sharp is extremely important. And with a personal touch as a sign off for today's hot take, life is short, and you sometimes need to spend it saving your money, but also living for today. And the best way to live is to have conversations with brilliant people who write things and challenge you. So, Mark, I thank you very much. Diane, rest in peace. Until next time, be safe, be good, have a great day.
Thank you.